Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to the Masculinities and Health online event series brought to you by Vic Health and the Jesuit Social Services. This is the second in the series, and today we're going to be talking about framing masculinity. We had a great event a couple of weeks ago, and we're sure that this is going to be another really fascinating session. So my name's Emma Fulu, and I'm going to be your MC today. I'm the founder and director of the Equality Institute, and I've been involved in research on gender, masculinities and violence against women for nearly 2 decades. So personally, I'm really excited to be part of this event and to be hosting this important discussion today. So I know you can't see each other, but apparently over 600 people have signed up to this event. So there's people joining from all over the country, which is really exciting to see. So as we gather for this event, we're all physically dispersed, but I wanted to take a moment for us just to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we meet today. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the custodians of the land where I sit today, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all sit today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to land and waters of this country. So a little bit about the event today. First, we're going to have a bit of an overview of the message guide, Framing Masculinities. And this includes discussion of some of the recommendations that are designed to help practitioners, researchers and policymakers communicate more effectively about masculine stereotypes in Australia. So we'll hear from Professor Michael Flood and Mark Chenery about this. And then we're going to move into a panel discussion where you'll hear from some other experts as well. During the panel discussion, you can post your questions on Slido. You should see that now on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try and get to as many as we can in the panel discussion. If you've also got any technical issues, please also post that in Slido and the team will get to you as soon as they can. I just wanted to also let you know that this event is being recorded and we'll send that out to everyone at the end of the session. Finally, if you would like to and can multitask, please join the conversation on social media and use the hashtag Framing Masculinity. So before we get into the presentations, we wanted to get a sense from you, the participants, more about your work. So you should see a polling question come up on Slido, and we just want you to quickly answer that question, which is, what is a challenge that you face in your work promoting masculinities and health? You can choose as many options as you want. Maybe they all apply. Maybe there's some that stand out more and are more relevant to you. But this is going to help us get a sense of really the challenges that you're facing, and hopefully we can tailor some of our discussion today to help address some of those issues. So there's lots of different options there. I can already see some answers coming in, which is great. I'll give you just a minute or two to put in your responses, and then we'll see what is the most common response. So seems like we've got 160 responses. That's great. People keep going. So it looks like, as you're answering at the moment, the most commonly reported answer is reaching and involving men. So that's a challenge that you're facing in your work, and also making the case to men. So persuading them for the case for change. So I think we'll definitely be covering some of those issues today. So I look forward to hearing more from Mark and Michael and the other panelists to hopefully address some of those things for you. That's great. So I might get straight into the presentation. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Flood. He's an internationally recognised researcher on men, masculinities, gender equality and violence prevention. He's the author of Engaging Men and Boys in Violence Prevention and the lead editor of Engaging Men in Building Gender Equality and the International Encyclopedia of Men and Masculinity. So thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much. Right, so I'm going to pull out some key findings from the survey and offer some wider reflections on shifts in norms of masculinity in Australia. So, first thing I want to say is there's a continuum. There's a continuum of attitudes towards gender in Australia, from those highly supportive of feminism, progressive and feminist understandings of gender, through to those highly opposed to desirable or feminist understandings. And the Common Cause survey describes that continuum in terms of supporters, persuadables, and opponents. So supporters are about 1/4 of the population, and they show the highest levels of support for gender equality. Persuadables in the middle, about half the population, show lower levels of support. And then opponents, the remaining quarter, show the lowest levels. They're opposed to typical feminist positions on men and gender. So in the analysis in the full report, people in Australia have been categorised into 3 groups. 4 if we include the hard opponents. The hard opponents are a subset of the opponents. But on the ground, of course, people don't, divide up quite so neatly. We will see more uneven and blurry patterns. One of the first findings to note is that there's a consistent gender gap in attitudes towards gender, and that really echoes findings in other research. Men's attitudes towards gender are consistently less progressive, consistently poorer than women's. This research, other research, finds that comparing men to women, men are less supportive of principles of gender equality, less aware of sexism as systematic, as pervasive, and more likely to endorse men's dominance, particularly men's dominance in relationships and families. And ironically, men are even less aware than women of the constraints of masculinity themselves. Women are more likely to agree that masculinity constrains men's and boys' lives. So coming back to those attitudinal segments, if we think of who those segments are, twice as many women as men are supporters, twice as many men as women are opponents. If we flip that the other way around and ask who were the supporters, 2/3 of the supporters are women. If we think about the opponents, 2/3 of the opponents are men. Okay, let's look in a bit more detail at some of the attitudes we see. There's really 5 areas of attitudes that the sort of major survey reports. And one is about beliefs about men and masculinity in general. There's widespread agreement that traditional gender stereotypes are limiting and harmful for boys and men. And I think that's kind of extraordinary, really, that most people in Australia agree that gender stereotypes, dominant constructions of masculinity, are limiting for boys and men. Most people agree, for example, that masculine expectations or outdated ideas about masculinity constrain men and prevent men from living full lives, and that traditional ideas about masculinity contribute to social problems like suicide. Most people believe that boys need both women and men as role models rather than just men. But from this data and from that gender gap I described, it's also clear that masculinity is policed and enforced more by men than by women. Certainly, substantial numbers of women do support and police traditional constructions of masculinity, but that policing comes more from men because of men's greater agreement with those ideas. If we then look at specific masculine norms that traditionally have been part of masculinity, again, we see some interesting patterns. So, for example, the idea that a real man is a heterosexual man, the notions of compulsory heterosexuality, of homophobia, they're relatively weak in Australia. There's only weak support for the idea that men should dominate and control women in relationships, but large minorities of men, and particularly young men, do support that idea. What about gender as determined by biology on the one hand, or as shaped by society, as socially constructed on the other? There's broad support for the idea that boys and men's lives are shaped socially, shaped by social forces as much as they are by biology. At the same time, there is also support for the notion of natural differences between men and women. And as I comment in more detail in the full report, it may depend on how differences or the natural are understood. And particularly when we present ideas about men and women in biologically determinist terms, in biological terms, they do get greater endorsement. We see a greater support for biologically essentialist, biologically determinist notions. What about changing gender roles? There's widespread recognition of the need to open up gender roles, particularly because they constrain men's and boys' own health and well-being. So it's less a kind of political, ethical, feminist understanding and more a kind of health understanding that these things are limiting for boys and men. We need to open them up. There's very high agreement. Most people agree that progress towards gender equality will be good for men, that idea that men will benefit. There's very high agreement, almost universal agreement, that men can play a role in preventing violence against women. What about the notion of a war on men? What about anti-feminist messages? There is substantial support among people in Australia for some regressive, some anti-feminist attitudes, including the notions that criticising masculinity is unfair because most men are good and decent, hashtag not all men, and the idea that men are being lectured too much about toxic masculinity. Now, framing matters. One, I think, really significant finding of this survey as well is that how we frame messages about men, about gender, has a real impact on whether people agree with them, on what messages people will support. So when people are offered anti-feminist messages, substantial proportions of people endorse them, agree with them. And people with pre-existing conservative views, the opposition, will endorse them much, much more than persuadables or supporters. But when we frame messages in what I and many of you may think of as desirable terms, in more feminist terms, the opposition actually, surprisingly, agrees with them as much as persuadables and not much less than supporters do. The final pattern I want to mention is that the opposition, 1/4 of people in Australia, 1/4 of the respondents, are only a weak opposition. Many will agree with statements about gender when framed in desirable terms. But the hard opponents, that potentially kind of rusted on 8% of the population, they're likely to have more rigid views. We also see an unsure middle. Persuadables, about half of the population, often about a third or more of those persuadables don't know. Give them a statement about men, about gender, and a third or 40+% don't know what they think. So they're quite unsure about these issues. I want to end with some wider reflections on what we've found. This data is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. But other data does tell us that gender norms are changing. Gender norms are changing largely for the better. There's been an increase in support for basic notions of gender equality, the idea that women should have the same rights as men to participate in paid work, in political decision-making. If we think about support for men's domination, support for men's unfair power, that's greater when it comes to private and family life than when it comes to public life. And it's disturbing to note from other data, there's been no shift in people's attitudes towards men's dominance in relationships and families since 2009 to 2017. So there has been an overall increase in support for gender equality over the last decade or so, but there also have been some increases in regressive attitudes. And what about young men? What about our sons? I think about my son. I think about the other boys and young men that we know. Where do the kind of future men of this country stand? Young men, 16 to 17, show better attitudes than adult men on many issues in the survey. But young men's attitudes typically are far poorer, more conservative than those of young women and adult women. And given that young women's attitudes are often the most feminist, the most progressive of all, the gender gap is largest among young people. Young men also have the highest levels of endorsement of men's use of violence, men's homophobia, breadwinner roles, and men's power and control in relationships, and high levels of endorsement of anti-feminist statements. So there are some really troubling findings here about some young men. The data I've described is a snapshot, as I've said, but let's think for a moment about men themselves. Men's actual performances of gender, men's expressions of masculinity are diverse and shifting. So I want to end by adding some new terms to your vocabulary, some language for understanding that. There are new formations of masculinity, new ways of being men or doing gender emerging in Australia. And one new formation is what some people call hybrid masculinities, where young men, often white heterosexual young men, distance themselves from forms of masculinity that have been criticised and instead draw on and borrow some of the elements, the clothing, the music, other aspects of feminised or marginalised masculinities, incorporating them into their own gender performance. And that represents a kind of softening of how they do masculinity, but it doesn't necessarily shift systems of power and inequality in their own lives or in wider society. There's also some interesting processes to be aware of, and one is overcompensation. It's well documented that when men feel that their masculinity has been threatened or societal definitions of masculinity have been threatened, some react with overcompensation. Faced with masculinity challenge, some men try to reclaim their masculine status or reassert masculinity through overcompensation. And people have done experiments with groups of men where threaten their sense of masculinity in some way and then test how they respond. And men who feel that their masculinity has been threatened or denied, they're more likely to express homophobia, more likely to support war efforts, more likely to express stronger dominance attitudes, engage in harassment, and vote for masculine presidents. Dare I speak his name? And to avoid any behaviour seen as remotely feminine. So there's some interesting processes that are going on and that we need to sort of find our way around. Final point I want to make. We're focused today on data about attitudes and norms, but they're only part of gender. Sorry, let's see. No, that's all good. Gender also involves behaviours or practices, involves people's interpersonal relations, their interactions with others, and involves social institutions and social structures. So in thinking about gender and in trying to build healthier, more ethical lives for men and women and others, we have to pay attention not only to attitudes and norms, but to practices, relations, and structures. To shift men's lives, to shift others' lives, we have to shift not only attitudes and norms, but also the social structures that sustain them. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, that's so fascinating. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear how you're talking about that there's sort of these contradictory and complex sort of patterns and processes playing out, that on the one hand, we're seeing, improvements and advancement in attitudes towards gender equality, and on the other hand, we're seeing some really troubling patterns as well. And this idea of hybrid masculinity is really, really interesting. Before we move on to the presentation by Mark's going to be talking more about the actual Framing Masculinities guide. So we wanted just to find out through another polling question, who's actually already read the Framing Masculinities message guide. No judgment, of course, if you haven't, but it'll just help us to understand where you are at in terms of your familiarity with the guide. So we've got about 60-40 by the looks of it. 60% haven't read the guide yet, and 40% have. So hopefully that will help you, Mark, in framing some of your discussion. So Mark Chenery is the co-founder and director of Common Cause Australia, and he's a communications expert and trainer who works with progressive organisations and political parties to incorporate a science-based approach to values in their work. So he established Common Cause in 2014, and since then he's trained, or his organisation has trained over 5,000 campaigners, communicators and fundraisers from Australia and New Zealand in values-based community engagement. So thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So Michael's taken us through some of the fascinating insights that we gain from the research and how they connect to broader patterns and research. What I'm going to talk about very quickly is our approach to the message research before taking you through what are the key recommendations that emerged from it. But before I do, in order to explain our approach, have a look at what you're seeing on your screen here. Some black markings on a white background. What are you seeing? Are you seeing a rabbit looking to the right, or are you seeing a duck or some kind of bird looking to the left? Or are you perhaps able to see both? So most, if not all of you, chances are I'm going to go with 95% of you are able to see both. And what's going on is that your brain is very quickly toggling between different ways of perceiving the exact same information. And this is a really important concept in cognitive linguistics, which is one of the fields of research that forms the backbone of Common Cause, and that is known as biconceptualism. So the ability of our brains and us as human beings to perceive the exact same things from different perspectives. Now, this is why fact or rational-based messaging so often fails us, is because when we throw facts at people, what they do, without even realising they're doing it, is they fit those facts into existing narratives that they have, existing ways of making meaning out of the world. And if that way of making meaning out of the world doesn't fit the meaning that we were hoping to convey with our facts, they'll simply either ignore the facts because they don't fit their story, or they will twist those facts into somehow furthering their case, which might not be exactly what we wanted to communicate. So in our research, what we always do is focus on 3 different segments. So we break the population down into 3 attitudinal segments, no matter what issue we're working on. And we break them into supporters, opposition, and persuadables. So supporters are people who are quite fixed in their perspective or the frame through which they see the issue. The opposition are also quite fixed in the frame that they see the issue from, and persuadables are lovely, adaptable people who can quite easily toggle between seeing the issue from an opposition perspective or a supporter perspective, which also makes them a little bit frustrating for people who are deeply passionate about issues. In this particular case, what we found is when we conducted our dial test, which is an online survey lasting about 20 minutes long, in which we ask a whole bunch of different types of questions and question formats, and I'll take you through some of that in a moment. What we found is that the population split out like this. So this is a nationally representative sample by age, gender, and location. And so 25% of the population are supporters. They are people who are quite fixed in their frame. We don't have to worry about them. They're not going to abandon us anytime soon. They agree with our analysis of the problem and the solutions. Then we've got around 26% of the population who are opposition. And then we've got 49% of the population who are persuadable. So almost half of Australians are actually persuadable on this topic. They toggle between seeing it from our perspective and seeing it from quite an unhelpful opposition perspective. But that opposition segment was the really interesting one, and I've never come across this before, where the opposition was as weak as this opposition was, in the sense that they endorse all of the unhelpful ideas that we presented them with in the survey. But when we presented them with our perspective, framed well in terms of masculinity being masculine stereotypes that we wanted to free men from, all of a sudden the majority of that opposition turned into a soft opposition and was actually persuadable. So what we ended up doing is digging back into the data, and what we identified is just that 8% of people who are rightly called the opposition, and we call them the hard opposition. So people who are effectively unmovable on the topic. So what I'm going to show you now is one of the ways in which we tested all of this in the survey. So we asked a whole bunch of sort of more classic questions that you might see, including sort of forced choice and split sample questions and Likert scale questions. But we also audio recorded 5 messages. And what we did is that we asked people to listen to those messages. And as they were listening to the messages, they could dial up and down on their screens to indicate their level of agreement with what they were hearing in that moment. And what this gives us is a much more sort of moment by moment analysis of the messages, but also the emotional reaction people are having, because it's very hard to post-rationalize whether you should like something or not as you're constantly dialing up and down on your screen. So I'm going to play one of the messages that tested quite well in our survey. Now, this message wasn't perfect, and we sort of have refined it since based on what the lines do. But what you're going to see is you're going to see a line for the supporters, which is green, a line for the persuadables, which is orange, and a line for the opposition, which is red. Now, what we want to see is the supporters loving the message. We want to see them dialing up as high as possible, and anything above 70 is acceptable, but we want to see them rise as high as humanly possible. And then the persuadables, we want to see them follow the same sort of pattern and direction as the supporters, but they'll never get to the level of supporters because they're not by definition supporters. But so long as they're following the same trend, we're happy. And we actually want to see the opposition. And here you're looking at the hard opposition, that 8% of people. We want to see them actually alienated. We want to see them dialing down. Because if we are not confronting their worldview in which men should dominate women, homosexuality is unacceptable, boys should never wear dresses, all that stuff that they cannot be moved on, if we're not confronting that, then we're not actually telling a progressive story. So we want to see, basically we want to see the persuadables moving away from the opposition and towards us. So I'm going to play that message for you now.
We should all be free to live open, honest, and meaningful lives, but too many men and boys are still trapped by outdated ideas about being a real man. These unwritten rules put pressure on them to suppress parts of who they are. It's unhealthy for anyone to live a lesser life because they feel like they have to hide their true selves. It's time to free men and boys from the shackles of narrow stereotypes. Everyone should feel comfortable being themselves and carve out their own unique path in life.
So as you can see there, sort of halfway through the message, once we started to frame the problem more from the solution perspective and what we wanted to see more of, we really saw those persuadables dialing up and passing that sort of 70% baseline. But we can also see that that message clearly works on that 50% of the population that are persuadable, on the 25% that are supporters, and it is doing exactly what we want it to do with that sort of 8% hard opposition. Okay, so let's very quickly take you through the message tips that are in the guide, and then we can, hopefully you've got lots of questions that you can ask away in the panel session if you have them. The first key tip is, well, let's not pander to that vocal minority. There's a strong tendency amongst people who care deeply about issues, if someone says something that is either incorrect or misleading, to quickly point out the inaccuracies of their arguments. But what we're doing when we're doing that, when we're myth busting, we're basically hopping into their frame and accepting the way that they are talking about the issue. And we need to avoid doing that and instead talk about the issue from our perspective. So what we need to avoid doing is myth busting, as well as using all that masculinized jargon like, real men don't cry and so on, things that are just accepting their frame or reinforcing the importance of masculinity, but saying that it should somehow be a little bit different. Because keep in mind that there is only 8% of the population who are actually completely unmovable. That means that we have 92% of the population that are either already supporters or are movable to some degree. And I don't want to overemphasize that you can somehow win over 92% of the population, but they are movable. They can be influenced, but only when we tell the story our way, when we talk about masculinity as stereotypes that we need to move on from. So what that looks like in practice is we instead of saying we should teach our boys that real men show their emotions, we say we should teach our boys that it's healthy to show your emotions. So just getting rid of that masculinity or maleness pandering language. Masculine traits are not part of men's biology. They are stereotypes men have been taught to abide by. What we need to do here is get rid of the myth busting and simply go straight to our story and say that masculine stereotypes are outdated ideas that most of us are more than happy to leave behind. Second tip is not to box men in, and I love the fact that this is brought to you by the Jesuit Social Services, which have done the man box research. I really like that metaphor, and it turns out that it works quite well in the population as well. But the idea that I want to communicate with this tip is that when I spoke to and when we interviewed advocates for healthier forms of masculinity, one thing that came through is that they didn't feel like masculinity and femininity were useful concepts. They were limiting concepts for the most part, and in an ideal world would move beyond them. But they felt that the public wasn't ready to have that sort of more gender neutral conversation. And what our research suggests is that there is some room to move there. So when we tested a whole bunch of different phrases in which we sort of removed the concepts or actively talked against the concepts of masculinity and femininity, we actually got quite a high level of support from the public. So for example, 78% of people thought that being a good man is really just about being a good person. 75% thought that what we value in a man is what we should value in all people. And 72% of people thought that people should be free to explore and develop who they are without the pressure of gender stereotypes. So it appears that when we do frame masculinity and femininity in terms of gender stereotypes, people are absolutely willing to have a conversation about moving beyond them. So what that looks like in terms of recommendations is, instead of saying it's time we redesigned masculinity for the 21st century, which is basically saying we still need masculinity, let's just make it better, we say it's time we freed men from outdated masculine stereotypes. Instead of saying there is more than one way to be a man, which, by the way, I should tell you, tested well with the hard opposition. In other words, they like this idea, which is a red flag for me. We talk about you shouldn't be shackled to outdated ideas of what it means to be a man. Just be you. Third tip is to focus on solutions. So you would have seen that in the DAL test I showed you already, where it really starts to motivate those persuadables once we flip from talking about the problem to talking about the solutions. What we also looked at, and this is a general piece of advice, is that solution-focused messaging works better on persuadables, and in this particular issue, it works a lot better on men, perhaps unsurprisingly. So every time that we framed statements or issues from the perspective of a problem, this is the sort of level of support we had from men. So around 54% of men agreed that traditional ideas about masculinity contribute to men's high rates of suicide and depression. So this is a problem-focused statement. Every time then we moved into talking about solution-focused things, such as it's important to teach our boys it's okay to cry, we saw this sort of 20 to 25% boost in support from men specifically. And this is what we saw across the survey, from problem-focused to solution-focused messaging. So what that looks like in practice, I mean, we still have to talk about problems, but often we can frame them by talking about the behaviours we want to see more of rather than less of. So worrying about whether you're masculine or not limits your options in life. We can flip that to be freeing yourself from gender stereotypes increases your options in life. Instead of saying men trapped by traditional masculine stereotypes suffer worse physical and mental outcomes, which is absolutely true, we can also say, or instead say, men freed from traditional masculine stereotypes enjoy better physical and mental well-being. And this sort of positive aspirational focused messaging works both better on persuadables, including women who are in that persuadable group, but also on men specifically. And finally, my final tip for you is to use the power of social norming. So unfortunately, us human beings are driven by all sorts of subconscious biases that we don't realise. And I probably don't need to tell people working on gender equality that. But one of the interesting things is that we can flip that and we can use it to our advantage. And it means that we need to stop referring to masculinity, for example, as dominant masculinity. So implying that this is something that most people agree with and support and endorse, when actually all the research seems to be pointing in the direction of it being now quite a recessive way of thinking about things, or sort of a minority of people endorse these views. That was certainly the case in our research. And so let's use that to our advantage and let's point that out. So for example, instead of saying, although most people expect men to be strong, independent and in control, it's not healthy for men to live up to these ideals all the time. And I should say that all my from statements are drawn directly from the public discourse as it was when we did our research. And instead say that most people want men to be respectful, caring and loving above all else, rather than sticking to rigid gender stereotypes, which is also true and part of the facts that we uncovered in our research. Instead of saying that challenging outdated ideas of what it means to be a man is difficult because they are so deeply embedded in our culture, which is true, we can point to the flip side of that and talk about the fact that most men are sick and tired of outdated masculine stereotypes and are happy to leave them behind, which is also true. So focusing more on that rather than the less helpful stuff. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks. Wow, I feel like I'm learning so much, and I definitely haven't been using the right language in my messaging sometimes when I think about it. It's really, really practical. And when we think about that work around really thinking about how we're positive and aspirational and what's going to appeal to people. And I hadn't even thought before about the idea of we actually want message that does confront that sort of hard opposition group. We don't want it at all pander to them. And if it is making, as the red line was going down, that's actually a good sign. I thought that was, it's really, really interesting and very, very practical and useful. So let's get started on our panel. So you already know Mark and Michael, so they'll be on the panel, but I'm going to introduce you to our two other panelists, which is Zoe Francis. Zoe, do you want to just say a quick hello and then we have Kesh Sharma.
Hello, everyone.
So Zoe is a health promotion coordinator at Women's Health in the Southeast, and she's been working in the prevention and health promotion sector for the last 8 years. And she's dedicated to actively engaging both men and women in gender equality work. Zoe also coordinates the PBOR strategy for the Southeast, Preventing Violence Together. And Kesh runs his own organisation called hUmen, which focuses on helping organisations engage men in gender equality. And he also works developing systems for wellbeing informed by systems positive psychology with the University of Melbourne, and also working with Mahana culture to help create culturally intelligent organisations. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
It's great to have you all here. So Mark, I was just sort of following on from what you were talking about. What most surprised you about the findings in the research? Was there anything that you weren't expecting?
I was hoping, but not expecting that our real opposition would be that small. And so I was obviously very surprised, but also very confused at how persuadable that soft opposition was, and to see them responding to our messages the way they were. But actually what surprised me the most was the degree of change that happened through the survey. So one thing that we do in the survey is we ask some attitudinal questions before and after people hear those audio dials, so 5 audio messages. And normally what you would see is some level of shift, 2, 3, 4, 5% shift in attitudes before and after hearing those messages. And what we saw was actually massive shifts in attitudes across everything that we wanted. So we saw, for example, 5% of people say, increased in 5% of people who said that there are things that all men can do to prevent violence against women, 7% increase in those who thought that increasing gender equality for women will also be good for men. And the one that was the key measure of this project was a 24% increase in number of people who thought that men will be better off if they break free from narrow gender stereotypes. And one of the reasons perhaps why we saw these massive shifts is because, and this is amongst the persuadables, by the way, all those percentages, is because those persuadables were so, before they approached this topic, they were sitting on the fence, like Michael pointed out. So large numbers of people who didn't really hold strong attitudes on the issue. And so what that suggests to me is that we do have an opportunity here through the correct or useful framing to talk to Australians about this topic area and really drive significant progress. And obviously this is in an artificial environment, that 24% of persuadables all of a sudden on our side. But the sort of work that a lot of practitioners do, which is much more sort of practical, in conversation, that should be even more persuasive than a few quick audio messages heard online.
That's great news. It's good when you get more positive findings than you expected, for sure. Zoe, so you're working sort of on the ground with communities. So how will your organisation use the message guide at the local level in a real practical way?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So I think what's really exciting about the messaging guide is that it allows the whole sector to move towards the how. There's lots of energy and appetite in the sector to engage men and boys in this work. And this document, I feel, really aids the practitioners to be able to delve into how we're going to frame effectively and how we're going to bring men and boys along in this work. And I think one thing that's very exciting is that not only are we going to be able to be more persuasive when we have men and boys in the room, in sessions, in the community, but that also it might actually open up the opportunity for our sector to be more gender balanced. So imagine the messaging that would send out if, as a workforce, we have more of a gender balance. So I think there's lots of exciting opportunities there. The solution-based thinking, I think, is just so effective. It's something I'm really passionate about. That solution-based approach, I just think, is so much more persuasive when we look towards the vision of what we want to see. And I just think that as practitioners, our role now is to kind of to absorb this, have a think about it, and then to make sure that when we go out into the community that we are still being the translators and brokers of the data. So a very quick recent example, I'm working with the Rohingya community. A great privilege Wise had to work with that community, and we worked with the community leaders to hear what they felt would work in terms of gender equality and breaking down gender stereotypes. And very much for them, it was about framing the messages for the next generation. So it was about parenting, because there were some concerns about trying to send strong messages to very traditional communities that might have even raised safety issues. So for them and that community, I think these learnings are really what they were pointing to. But this just strengthens it and allows us to use it in terms of being those translators and brokers to connect with community and hear how best to inform the work.
Thank you. That's very helpful. While we're on the kind of practical side of things, I might actually ask Kesh to talk about your work in engaging and communicating with men and boys and how you think this is going to work in practice, or how you might have already been using it in practice in your own work.
Yeah, I would love to, and just thankful and how glad I am to be on this panel to bring this work out into the community. I really wish I had something like this that existed when I started doing this work, because the people like myself and the people that came before me, like my mentor Paul Zappa, we just had trial and error going out and seeing what landed. So I'm glad that so many other people are going to be able to take this work forward and not have mistakes and create a greater impact. I have so much I want to say, but I don't want to take up too much time. So I just want to touch on each of the tips and have a talk about how that looks like in practice. So number one, don't pander to the vocal minority. To me, this is actually one of the ones that is the most difficult to do, because when the vocal minority rises up, you're put into a bit of a double bind. If you ignore it or move past it and you don't take it seriously, you can be seen as a censor or dodging the argument, which can lend it credence. But if you take it seriously, like Mark said, then you give it legitimacy as a real argument and you reinforce it in people's brains. So the question there is, as a practitioner, what do you do? And my answer to that is, on the ground, you have to really be aware of the severity of what is being said. Many things come from people who genuinely don't know, or are asking genuine questions or giving genuine opinions on things that they believe. And in that case, I find curiosity and compassion are the best option, and to not actually solve the problem and let the collective unravel the problem with the idea itself. How you approach the opposition, often it's less what you say, but how you do it that persuades people. But if something's outrageously untrue or false or harmful, then this is, you need this tip. Don't fight the argument, just counter with your own message instead. Number two, don't box men in. I actually named my organization hUmen after this principle, because what we found time and time again was, while understanding the impacts of gender was the beginning, where was the end? Like, if gendered stereotypes were not reliable or useful or even harmful, what is that replaced with? So the messaging that has evolved in the last 5 years for me is that both men and women need the same things as human beings to be happy, healthy, and successful. We need both masculine and feminine qualities and behaviors to be whole. And when you can't draw on half of your humanity, then you're going to run into problems, right? So it's not about being men or women, it's about being human. And reframing that message, not as an equalization of things that exist, which creates all kinds of issues, but as a freedom from the constraints altogether, has worked the best. Number three, being solutions focused. I feel like this tip has actually been the core part of why me, myself, and the teams that I've been a part of have been invited into places where other organizations have not been able to go into or were booed out of. Places that are heavily masculine stereotypes, like, electrical trades union, sporting clubs, because we tended to focus on what you can do rather than what the problem is. We always tried to paint a vision of a positive future and that person's place in creating that positive future rather than the negative present reality. So I think there's always a conflation, being people that work in information, that when you have knowledge, you want to share it and to believe that knowledge will solve the problem. And we need to let go of the conflation between information about the problem and the solution, because they're often two very different things. Knowing the problem shows us where we need to work, but it doesn't always tell us how we need to work there. And that relies on our understanding of who we're working with and what we want them to do. And not asking people to figure that out, just providing a positive vision of the future that people want to be a part of, providing a positive role in the creation of that vision, and you give the person everything that they need to start building that future right now. Number 4, Yusuf.
Go ahead, Kesh. And then I might get to some Slido questions because I know there's lots coming in from the audience.
Okay, I'll just do this one really quickly. Basically, just be really careful around what you're setting as the norm. Like they said, we often think that people hearing the story about how prevalent things are will get them to act on a message, but it usually just makes them think this is normal. And I will say the 5th tip that isn't on there, never talk about masculinity alone. Gender means both men and women, everyone along that spectrum and everyone outside of it. And to not acknowledge that, that gender means more than just men is a surefire way to get people offside in opposition. So in short, these tips work. I've used them in practice. So go out there and have fun.
Thank you so much, Kesh. It's really interesting. We're sort of really hearing these common themes coming out. I think around the humanness and the freedom and aspirational, where we're trying to get to in this work and this solutions kind of focused effort. So that's really coming through strongly. I've got lots of questions on Slido, so I'm going to, maybe I can start with you, Michael, from one. The question is, if we think that young men's attitudes are a reflection of society as a whole, but that gender norms are changing for the better, then why are men still having the worst attitudes?
That's a great question. Man, talk about a tough one. Look, I think there's a bunch of different things going on. One is that change is uneven. And so there's, change among young men in general, and there is overall positive change among young men, but there's still substantial proportions who believe, some of these kind of regressive ideas about men and gender. And there's some evidence that there's also kind of regress, that some groups of young men are actually getting worse in their attitudes. And that may be a kind of backlash effect. It may be a growing kind of discomfort with and resistance to gender equality among young men. It may be the influence of increasingly powerful forms of cultural media such as pornography. It may be other things as well. But certainly we shouldn't assume a kind of rosy view that things are necessarily getting better among men in general, because that's clearly not true from this survey.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that question? Kesh?
I just want to throw in the mix there that often men are being asked to change, but no one's giving them a way to do that. And that creates the problem. That to me creates the problem. So they fall back on what they know and they go even heavier into that. But when they're provided with a solution, a different way of being, and somebody is helping guide them into that, then I think they're much more ready for change. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So the next question I've got here is, can we engage men without just appealing to the idea that it is best for their own health? Can we get them to consider the impact of their attitudes on others? And I've got Mark raising a hand. Go ahead, Mark.
Yes, we can. So in our research, we looked at the different ways of framing the benefits of escaping masculine stereotypes and framing that both in terms of the benefits for men themselves, but also benefits for women and girls and others. And what we found is that people were overall supportive of both ways of framing the benefits of escaping masculine stereotypes, although I will say there was a stronger support for the idea that it impacted on men. So the idea that masculinity hurts men is stronger than the fact that masculinity, for example, causes violence against women. But there is positive signs there. It is absolutely possible. It's just a little bit harder. Yeah.
Michael, did you want to add anything, or Zoe?
Yeah, that's right. People are more comfortable with the idea that traditional masculinity contributes to suicide or mental health issues, which it absolutely does, than they are with the idea that traditional masculinity contributes to men's use of violence against women, which it also absolutely does. So as Mark said, I think there's a greater kind of comfort with an appeal to men's self-interest than an appeal to men's ethical obligations to challenge the inequalities that we also gain unfair privilege from. But we have to do both. And, you know, I was amazed to see that the vast majority of people in Australia agree that men have a positive role to play in ending violence against women. So certainly there's some positive news, some things that we can draw on in engaging men in change.
Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing there. And sort of, there's always the questions to me, okay, so why do we want to talk about it from one perspective or another? One of the things that we were concerned about with this was, let's do a whole survey on men and how tough it is being a man with masculinity and everything. And what impact is that going to have on how men perceive gender relations and gender inequality? And what we found happily was that actually, even though we spent an entire survey focusing on masculinity and it's, for the most part, its impact on men, what we ended up doing is we ended up increasing support for gender equality more broadly, and the idea that that women have it tougher in life than men. So these sort of support for those ideas increased through the course of the survey and through the course of talking about masculinity and focusing on its impact on men, which I thought was interesting and useful to know. So it doesn't seem to be a risk of focusing on men and the impacts of masculinity on men in terms of decreasing concern for gender equality or women's rights.
And that's really interesting. It actually kind of relates to another question that's up here around this idea. If you are framing this as everyone should feel comfortable being themselves and carve out their own unique path in life, does that run the risk of maintaining the status quo and just not actually shifting the power structures? And I know, Mark, you were talking a bit before about, and Michael, I think as well, it's not just about attitudes and norms that we need to be thinking of behaviours and the systems and structures. Anyone want to comment on that question?
I think we have to, as part of this work, directly criticise some of the specific ideas about masculinity that sustain gender inequalities, that feed into violence, that constrain men's own health. So we can't just say everybody be yourself. We have to also directly undermine norms of male power in relationships, norms of male stoicism, of compulsory heterosexuality, and so on.
So in the guide itself, we have a recommendation towards the end in the words to use and lose in public, and that is to talk about the fact that men should be free to be themselves and not be judged by outdated ideas of masculinity. So to combine that element of be yourself with the idea of reminding people of those outdated ideas that we need to break free from. Yeah.
Thanks. What have we got? We've got a few more minutes. I've got a few more questions I want to cover. So Zoe, you were in your work, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges you might have had in communicating on the topic of masculinity, and anything around these kind of ideas around messaging that you're seeing working and not working.
Yeah, I think essentially we're trying really hard as I run the strategy for the prevention of violence against women in the southeast region of Melbourne. And as I mentioned before, we've got the evidence base. We've got a very strong workforce who are very engaged in bringing men and boys along for the journey. And what we've done recently is we've created a network called the Critical Friends Network. And that's practitioners across our region who are working to support the rollout of the Respectful Relationships Initiative. So that's been really fantastic because that's that true kind of primary prevention, it's early intervention. So we're working really hard to not only support the rollout of the Respectful Relationships, but we're working to bring along the key messaging around engaging men and boys into that work. So making sure that that lens is there in the mainstream for staff working in schools, and ensuring that they can see that those gender stereotypes are not only limiting for women and girls, which has traditionally been the kind of starting point for this work. It's feminist informed. It must always be highlighted that this work is feminist informed, but that teachers are looking to see the benefits for men and boys and the next generation coming through. So really exciting to be working as a broad partnership to really scale up this work and embed it in the structures that already exist at the state level, certainly here in Victoria. It's an exciting time.
Thanks, Zoe. One other question we'll see how might be our last question is around the following on from that around the terminology. And I know one in the guide it recommends that we steer away from using the term masculinity, which we all use all the time, I think, with the public, and instead talk about masculine stereotypes, and that being related to the fact that people tend to conflate masculinity with men. Can you talk a bit more about that, perhaps starting with you, Mark?
Yeah, so importantly, this recommendation is about how to talk to the public, especially when you don't have an in-depth conversation where you can go through all the details as people like Kesh do in his work. When we're talking to each other, let's talk about masculinity or femininity because we know what those concepts mean. But when talking to the public, it's just not helpful because they conflate masculinity and men. And therefore, when we say masculinity, they hear men and they get a completely different meaning from the context of the sentence. And so instead of talking about masculinity, we talk about masculine stereotypes. Instead of talking about healthier masculinities, we talk about freedom from unhealthy masculine stereotypes or gender stereotypes. For men and so on. So it is all about providing some context around the concept of masculinity every time we use it in public. So to never throw the naked masculinity out there, but to pair it with either stereotypes or ideas or associations or expectations, any sort of word that couches it in the sense that it is a construction of ideas and expectations. Yeah.
Rather than an identity or all-encompassing of a person.
Yeah, or a thing that just is men.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone have anything they wanted to add to that? Kesh?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, even on the practice side, one thing that I always recommend to people that are doing work with men and masculinities is to start at the very beginning. We often skip that stuff and try to get straight to the meaty work, but going back and defining the difference between sex and gender, male, female, masculinity, femininity, getting all these terms right, because often people don't know what we're talking about. This language gets lost, it gets mixed up. People think masculinity means men. So starting at the very beginning and getting your terms straight is necessary. Right? It's a step that can't be skipped.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask one final question, which may be ending on a challenging one, but there's a few questions here around sort of the relationship between masculinity and femininity, and should there be a comparable guide on femininity, or what is this relationship, and is it problematic that we're just talking about masculinity? Maybe I can just throw to you, Michael, for quick thoughts.
Sure. Look, the first thing we have to recognise is that constructions of gender are relational, and focusing today on men and masculinity, one of the obvious things to note about what it means to be a man is often that's defined in terms of being not women, avoiding stereotypically feminine qualities. Equally, you could imagine a project focused on femininity and health, femininity and violence, because we know that stereotypical feminine qualities, being submissive, being passive, being emotional and nurturing and so on, there's kind of those historical stereotypes, they constrain women's lives and they make it less likely that women will be sexually assertive, less likely to challenge violence in relationships and so on. And so the work of addressing masculinity and femininity is a kind of shared project. Part of this too, two other things. We have to address the cultural devaluing of femininity, the way in which stereotypically feminine qualities are devalued. The final thing is we have to challenge gender binaries themselves. And in a sense, the phrase healthy masculinity may keep us tied too closely to making sure that men avoid anything stereotypically feminine. We actually have to break down, I think, those gender binaries and those gender categories themselves to some extent. Although, as Mark has said, that's something to be done carefully.
Great. Yes, fully agree. I think we might have run out of time, unfortunately. There's so many questions still, but I've been told that we are going to follow up on some of those unanswered questions on Slido and publish and send responses to you after the event. So don't worry that your question didn't get answered. We will get to it. So I just want to thank all the panel members for this really fascinating discussion. I think this is such a powerful piece of work and it's going to be really useful and can apply to so many areas of work, not just violence prevention, but various areas where you might be working with men and boys or communities in general. So check out the Vic Health website for the latest suite of resources around this. I know they're planning to develop some animations to try and bring to life this guide as well. So stay tuned and watch this space for that. We will be sending around a link to the recording of this event, the resources, along with the short evaluation. So we'd really be very grateful if you could complete that evaluation. And also now we will be answering your additional Slido questions. So you'll hear from us soon, and just wanted to thank you all again for joining, and stay safe everybody. All the best. Take care. Thank you. Bye.